Chapter 3 The Coming of the Mist. We worked our way back to the fruits and vegetables like salmon fighting their way upstream. I saw some familiar faces: Mike Hayden, one of our selectmen, Mrs. Repler from the grammar school. She who had terrified generations of third graders was currently sneering at the cantaloupes. Mrs. Turman, who sometimes sat Billy when Steph and I went out. But mostly they were summer people stocking up on no-cook items and joshing each other about roughing it. The cold cuts had been picked over as thoroughly as the dime book tray at a rummage sale. There was nothing left but a few packages of bologna, some macaroni loaf, and one lonely phallic kielbasa sausage. I got tomatoes, cukes, and a jar of mayonnaise. She wanted bacon, but all the bacon was gone. I picked up some of the bologna as a substitute, although I've never been able to eat the stuff with any real enthusiasm since the FDA reported that each package contained a small amount of insect filth, a little something extra for your money. Look, Billy said as we rounded the corner into the fourth aisle. There's some army guys. There were two of them, their dun uniforms standing out against the much brighter background of summer clothes and sportswear. We had gotten used to seeing a scattering of army personnel with the Arrowhead Project only 30 miles or so away. These two looked hardly old enough to shave yet. I glanced back down at Steph's list and saw that we had everything. No, almost, but not quite. At the bottom, as an afterthought, she had scribbled, "Bottle of Lancers?" That sounded good to me. A couple of glasses of wine tonight after Billy had sacked out, then maybe a long, slow bout of lovemaking before sleep. I left the cart and worked my way down to the wine and got a bottle. As I walked back, I passed the big double doors leading to the storage area and heard the steady roar of a good-sized generator. I decided it was probably just big enough to keep the cold cases cold, but not large enough to power the doors and cash registers and all the other electrical equipment. It sounded like a motorcycle back there. Norton appeared just as we got into line, balancing 2 6-packs of Schlitz Light, a loaf of bread, and the kielbasa I had spotted a few minutes earlier. He got in line with Billy and me. It seemed very warm in the market with the air conditioning off, and I wondered why none of the stock boys had at least chalked the doors open. I had seen Buddy Eagleton in his red apron 2 aisles back, doing nothing and piling it up. The generator roared monotonously. I had the beginnings of a headache. "Put your stuff in here before you drop something," I said. "Thanks." The lines were up past the frozen food now. People had to cut through to get what they wanted, and there was much excuse meing and pardon meing. "This is going to be a bitch," Norton said morosely, and I frowned a little. That sort of language is rougher than I'd like Billy to hear. The generator's roar muted a little as the line shuffled forward. Norton and I made desultory conversation, skirting around the ugly property dispute that had landed us in district court and sticking with things like the Red Sox chances and the weather. At last, we exhausted our little store of small talk and fell silent. Billy fidgeted beside me. The line crawled along. Now we had frozen dinners on our right and the more expensive wines and champagnes on our left. As the line progressed down to the cheaper wines, I toyed briefly with the idea of picking up a bottle of Ripple, the wine of my flaming youth. I didn't do it. My youth never flamed that much anyway. "Geez, why can't they hurry up, Dad?" Billy asked. That pinched look was still on his face, and suddenly, briefly, the mist of disquiet that had settled over me rifted, and something terrible peered through from the other side, the bright and metallic face of terror. Then it passed. "Keep cool, champ," I said. We had made it up to the bread racks to the point where the double line bent to the left. We could see the checkout lanes now, the two that were open and the other four, deserted, each with a little sign on the stationary conveyor belt. Signs that read, "Please choose another lane," and "Winston." Beyond the lanes was the big sectioned plate glass window, which gave a view of the parking lot and the intersection of routes 117 and 302 beyond. The view is partially obscured by the white paperbacks of signs advertising current specials and the latest giveaway, which happened to be a set of books called the Mother Nature Encyclopedia. We were in the line that would eventually lead us to the checkout where Bud Brown was standing. There were still maybe 30 people in front of us. The easiest one to pick out was Mrs. Carmody in her blazing yellow pantsuit. She looked like an advertisement for yellow fever. Suddenly, a shrieking noise began in the distance. It quickly built up in volume and resolved itself into the crazy warble of a police siren. A horn blared at the intersection, and there was a shriek of brakes and burning rubber. I couldn't see. The angle was all wrong. But the siren reached its loudest as it approached the market, and then began to fade as the police car went past. A few people broke out of line to look, but not many. They had waited too long to chance losing their places. Norton went. His stuff was tucked into my cart. After a few moments, he came back and got into line again. Local fuzz, he said. Then the town fire whistle began to wail, slowly cranking up to a shriek of its own, falling off, then rising again. Billy grabbed my hand, clutched it. "What is it, Daddy?" he asked, and then immediately, "Is Mommy all right?" "Must be a fire on the Kansas road," Norton said. "Those damn live lines from the storm. The fire trucks will go through in a minute." That gave my disquiet something to crystallize on. There were live lines down in our yard. Bud Brown said something to the checker he was supervising. She had been craning around to see what was happening. She flushed and began to run her calculator again. I didn't want to be in this line. All of a sudden, I very badly didn't want to be in it. But it was moving again, and it seemed foolish to leave now. We had gotten down by the cartons of cigarettes. Someone pushed through the inn door. Some teenager. I think it was the kid we almost hit coming in, the one on the Yamaha with no helmet. "The fog," he yelled. "You ought to see the fog. It's rolling right up Kansas Road." People looked around at him. He was panting as if he had run a long distance. Nobody said anything. "Well, you ought to see it," he repeated, sounding defensive this time. People eyed him, and some of them shuffled, but no one wanted to lose his or her place in line. A few people who hadn't reached the lines yet left their carts and strolled through the empty checkout lanes to see if they could see what he was talking about. A big guy in a summer hat with a paisley band, the kind of hat you almost never see except in beer commercials with backyard barbecues as their settings, yanked open the outdoor, and several people, 10, maybe a dozen, went out with him. The kid went along. "Don't let out the air conditioning," one of the army kids cracked, and there were a few chuckles. I wasn't chuckling. I had seen the mist coming across the lake. "Billy, why don't you go have a look?" Norton said. "No," I said at once, for no concrete reason. The line moved forward again. People craned their necks looking for the fog the kid had mentioned, but there was nothing on view except the bright blue sky. I heard someone say that the kid must have been joking. Someone else responded that he had seen a funny line of mist on Long Lake not an hour ago. The first whistle whooped and screamed. I didn't like it. It sounded like big league doom blowing that way. More people went out. A few even left their places in line, which speeded up the proceedings a bit. Then grizzled old John Lee Froven, who works as a mechanic at the Texaco station, came ducking in and yelled, "Hey, anybody got a camera?" He looked around, then ducked back out again. That caused something of a rush. If it was worth taking a picture of, it was worth seeing. Suddenly, Mrs. Carmody cried in her rusty but powerful old voice, "Don't go out there." People turned around to look at her. The orderly shape of the lines had grown fuzzy as people left to get a look at the mist, or as they drew away from Mrs. Carmody, or as they milled around, seeking out their friends. A pretty young woman in a cranberry-colored sweatshirt and dark green slacks was looking at Mrs. Carmody in a thoughtful, evaluating way. A few opportunists were taking advantage of whatever the situation was to move up a couple of places. The checker beside Bud Brown looked over her shoulder again, and Brown tapped her shoulder with a long finger. "Keep your mind on what you're doing, Sally." "Don't go out there," Mrs. Carmody yelled. "It's death. I feel that it's death out there." Bud and Ollie Weeks, who both knew her, just looked impatient and irritated. But any summer people around her stepped smartly away, never minding their places in line. The bag ladies in big cities seem to have the same effect on people, as if they were carriers of some contagious disease. Who knows? Maybe they are. Things began to happen at an accelerating, confusing pace then. A man staggered into the market, shoving the inn door open. His nose was bleeding. "Something in the fog," he screamed, and Billy shrank against me. Whether because of the man's bloody nose or what he was saying, I don't know. "Something in the fog! Something in the fog! Took John Lee! Something—" He staggered back against a display of lawn food stacked by the window and sat down there. "Something in the fog took John Lee, and I heard him screaming." The situation changed. Made nervous by the storm, by the police siren and the fire whistle, by the subtle dislocation any power outage causes in the American psyche, and by the steadily mounting atmosphere of unease as things somehow changed. I don't know how to put it any better than that. People began to move in a body. They didn't bolt. If I told you that, I would be giving you entirely the wrong impression. It wasn't exactly a panic. They didn't run, or at least most of them didn't, but they went. Some of them just went to the big show window on the far side of the checkout lanes to look out. Others went out the indoor, some still carrying their intended purchases. Bud Brown, harried and officious, began yelling, "Hey, you haven't paid for that! Hey, you, come back here with those hot dog rolls!" Someone laughed at him, a crazy yodeling sound that made other people smile. Even as they smiled, they looked bewildered, confused, and nervous. Then someone else laughed, and Brown flushed. He grabbed a box of mushrooms away from a lady who was crowding past him to look out the window. The segments of glass were lined with people now. They were like the folks you see looking through loopholes into a building site, and the lady screamed, "Give me back my mushies!" This bizarre term of affection caused two men standing nearby to break into crazy laughter, and there was something of the old English bedlam about all of it now. Mrs. Carmody trumpeted again not to go out there, and the fire whistle whooped breathlessly, a strong old woman who had scared up a prowler in the house, and Billy burst into tears. "Daddy, what's that bloody man? Why is that bloody man?" "It's okay, Big Bill. It's his nose. It's okay." "What did he mean, something in the fog?" Norton asked. He was frowning ponderously, which was probably Norton's way of looking confused. "Daddy, I'm scared," Billy said through his tears. "Can we please go home?" Someone bumped past me roughly, jolting me off my feet, and I picked Billy up. I was getting scared, too. The confusion was mounting. Sally, the checker by Bud Brown, started away, and he grabbed her back by the collar of her red smock. It ripped. She slap-clawed out at him, her face twisting. "Get your effing hands off me," she screamed. "Oh, shut up, you little bitch," Brown said, but he sounded totally astounded. He reached for her again, and Ollie Weeks said sharply, "Bud, cool it." Someone else screamed. It hadn't been a panic before, not quite, but it was getting to be one. People streamed out of both doors. There was a crash of breaking glass, and Coke fizzled suddenly across the floor. "What the Christ is this?" Norton exclaimed. That was when it started getting dark. But no, that's not exactly right. My thought at the time was not that it was getting dark, but that the lights in the market had gone out. I looked up at the fluorescence in a quick reflex action, and I wasn't alone. And at first, until I remembered the power failure, it seemed that was it. That was what had changed the quality of the light. Then I remembered they had been out all the time we had been in the market, and things hadn't seemed dark before. Then I knew, even before the people at the window started to yell and point. The mist was coming. It came from the Kansas Road entrance to the parking lot, and even this close it looked no different than it had when we first noticed it on the far side of the lake. It was white and bright, but non-reflecting. It was moving fast, and it had blotted out most of the sun. Where the sun had been, there was now a silver coin in the sky, like a full moon in winter seen through a thin scud of cloud. It came with lazy speed. Watching it reminded me somehow of last evening's waterspout. There are big forces in nature that you hardly ever see. Earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes. I haven't seen them all, but I've seen enough to guess that they all move with that lazy, hypnotizing speed. They hold you spellbound, the way Billy and Steffi had been in front of the picture window last night. It rolled impartially across the two-lane blacktop and erased it from view. The McKeon's nice restored Dutch colonial was swallowed whole. For a moment, the second floor of the ramshackle apartment building next door jutted out of the whiteness, and then it went too. The Keep Right sign at the entrance and exit points to the Federal's parking lot disappeared, the black letters on the sign seeming to float for a moment in limbo after the sign's dirty white background was gone. The cars in the parking lot began to disappear next. "What the Christ is this?" Norton asked again, and there was a catch in his voice. It came on, eating up the blue sky and the fresh black hot top with equal ease. Even 20 feet away, the line of demarcation was perfectly clear. I had the nutty feeling that I was watching some extra good piece of visual effects, something dreamed up by Willis O'Brien or Douglas Trumbull. It happened so quickly. The blue sky disappeared to a wide swipe, then to a stripe, then to a pencil line. Then it was gone. Blank white pressed against the glass of the wide show window. I could see as far as the little litter barrel that stood maybe 4 feet away, but not much further. I could see the front bumper of my Scout, but that was all. A woman screamed, very loud and long. Billy pressed himself more tightly against me. His body was trembling like a loose bundle of wires with high voltage running through them. A man yelled and bolted through one of the deserted lanes toward the door. I think that was what finally started the stampede. People rushed pell-mell into the fog. "Hey!" Brown roared. I don't know if he was angry, scared, or both. His face was nearly purple. Veins stood out on his neck, looking as thick as battery cables. "Hey, you people, you can't take that stuff! Get back here with that stuff! You're shoplifting!" They kept going, but some of them tossed their stuff aside. Some were laughing and excited, but they were a minority. They poured out into the fog, and none of us who stayed ever saw them again. There was a faint, acrid smell drifting in through the open door. People began to jam up there. Some pushing and shoving started. I was getting an ache in my shoulders from holding Billy. He was good-sized. Steph sometimes called him a young heifer. Norton started to wander off, his face preoccupied and rather bemused. He was heading for the door. I switched Billy to the other arm so I could grab Norton's arm before he drifted out of reach. "No, man, I wouldn't," I said. He turned back. "What?" "Better wait and see." "See what?" "I don't know," I said. "You don't think," he began, and a shriek came out of the fog. Norton shut up. The tight jam at the outdoor loosened and then reversed itself. The babble of excited conversation, shouts, and calls subsided. The faces of the people by the door suddenly looked flat and pale and two-dimensional. The shriek went on, competing with the fire whistle. It seemed impossible that any human pair of lungs could have enough air in them to sustain such a shriek. Norton muttered, "Oh my God," and ran his hands through his hair. The shriek ended abruptly. It did not dwindle. It was cut off. One more man went outside, a beefy guy in chino work pants. I think he was set on rescuing the shrieker. For a moment he was out there, visible through the glass in the mist, like a figure seen through milk scum on a tumbler. Then, and as far as I know, I was the only one to see this, something beyond him appeared to move, a gray shadow in all that white, and it seemed to me that instead of running into the fog, the man in the chino pants was jerked into it, his hands flailing upward as if in surprise. For a moment there was total silence in the market. A constellation of moons suddenly glowed into being outside. The parking lot sodium lights, undoubtedly supplied by underground electrical cables, had just gone on. "Don't go out there," Mrs. Carmody said in her best Gore Crow voice. "It's death to go out there." All at once, no one seemed disposed to argue or laugh. Another scream came from outside, this one muffled and rather distant sounding. Billy tensed against me again. "David, what's going on?" Ollie Weeks asked. He had left his position. There were big beads of sweat on his round, smooth face. "What is this?" "I'll be goddamned if I have any idea," I said. Ollie looked badly scared. He was a bachelor who lived in a nice little house up by Highland Lake and who liked to drink in the bar at Pleasant Mountain. On the pudgy little finger of his left hand was a star sapphire ring. The February before, he won some money in the state lottery. He bought the ring out of his winnings. I always had the idea that Ollie was a little afraid of girls. "I don't dig this," he said. "No, Billy, I have to put you down. I'll hold your hand, but you're breaking my arms, okay?" "Mommy," he whispered. "She's okay," I told him. It was something to say. The old geezer who runs a second-hand shop near John's restaurant walked past us, bundled into the old collegiate letter sweater he wears year-round. He said loudly, "It's one of those pollution clouds. The mills at Rumford and South Paris. Chemicals." With that, he made off up the aisle 4, past the patent medicines and toilet paper. "Let's get out of here, David," Norton said with no conviction at all. "What do you say we—" There was a thud, an odd, twisting thud that I felt mostly in my feet, as if the entire building had suddenly dropped 3 feet. Several people cried out in fear and surprise. There was a musical jingle of bottles leaning off their shelves and destroying themselves upon the tile floor. A chunk of glass shaped like a pie wedge fell out of one of the segments in the wide front window, and I saw that the wooden frames banding the heavy sections of glass had buckled and splintered in some places. The fire whistle stopped in mid-whoop. The quiet that followed was the bated silence of people waiting for something else, something more. I was shocked and numb, and my mind made a strange cross-patch connection with the past. Back when Bridgeton was little more than a crossroads, my dad would take me in with him and stand talking at the counter while I looked through the glass at the penny candy and 2-cent shoes. It was January thaw. No sound but the drip of meltwater falling from the galvanized tin gutters to the rain barrels on either side of the store. Me looking at the jawbreakers and buttons and pinwheels, the mystic yellow globes of light overhead showing up the monstrous projected shadows of last summer's battalion of dead flies. A little boy named David Drayton looking at the candy and the Davy Crockett bubblegum cards and vaguely needing to pee. And outside, the pressing, billowing yellow fog of January thaw. The memory passed, but very slowly. You people, Norton bellowed. All you people, listen to me. They looked around. Norton was holding up both hands, his fingers splayed like a political candidate accepting accolades. It may be dangerous to go outside, Norton yelled. Why? A woman screamed back. My kids are at home. I gotta get back to my kids. It's death to go out there, Mrs. Carmody came back smartly. She was standing by the 25-pound sacks of fertilizer stacked below the window, and her face seemed to bulge somehow, as if she were swelling. A teenager gave her a sudden hard push, and she sat down on the bags with a surprised grunt. Stop saying that, you old bag. Stop rapping that crazy bullshit. Please, Norton yelled. If we just wait a few moments until it blows over and we can see. A babble of conflicting shouts greeted this. He's right, I said, shouting to be heard over the noise. Let's just try to keep cool. I think that was an earthquake, a bespectacled man said. His voice was soft. In one hand he held a package of hamburger and a bag of buns. The other hand was holding the hand of a little girl, maybe a year younger than Billy. I really think that was an earthquake. They had one over in Naples 4 years ago, a fat local man said. That was in Casco, his wife contradicted immediately. She spoke in the unmistakable tones of a veteran contradictor. Naples, the fat local man said, but with less assurance. Casco, his wife said firmly, and he gave up. Somewhere, a can that had been jostled to the very edge of its shelf by the thump, earthquake, whatever it had been, fell off with a delayed clatter. Billy burst into tears. I want to go home. I want my mother. Can't you shut that kid up? Bud Brown asked. His eyes were darting rapidly but aimlessly from place to place. Would you like a shot in the teeth, Motormouth? I asked him. Come on, Dave, that's not helping, Norton said distractedly. I'm sorry, the woman who had screamed earlier said. I'm sorry, but I can't stay here. I've got to get home and see to my kids. She looked around at us, a blonde woman with a tired, pretty face. Wanda's looking after little Victor, you see. Wanda's only 8, and sometimes she forgets. Forgets she's supposed to be, well, watching him, you know, and little Victor, he likes to turn on the stove burners to see the little red light come on. He likes that light, and sometimes he pulls out the plugs, little Victor does, and Wanda gets bored watching him after a while. She's just 8. She stopped talking and just looked at us. I imagine that we must have looked like nothing but a bank of merciless eyes to her right then. Not human beings at all, just eyes. Isn't anyone going to help me? She screamed. Her lips began to tremble. Won't anybody here see a lady home? No one replied. People shuffled their feet. She looked from face to face with her own broken face. The fat local man took a hesitant half step forward, and his wife jerked him back with one quick tug, her hand clapped over his wrist like a manacle. You? The blonde woman asked Ollie. He shook his head. You? She said to Bud. He put his hand over the Texas Instruments calculator on the counter and made no reply. You, she said to Norton, and Norton began to say something in his big lawyer's voice, something about how no one should go off half-cocked, and she dismissed him, and Norton just trailed off. You, she said to me, and I picked Billy up again and held him in my arms like a shield to ward off her terrible broken face. I hope you all rot in hell, she said. She didn't scream it. Her voice was dead tired. She went to the outdoor and pulled it open using both hands. I wanted to say something to her, call her back, but my mouth was too dry. Oh, lady, listen, the teenage kid who had shouted at Mrs. Carmody began. He held her arm. She looked down at his hand and he let her go, shamefaced. She slipped out into the fog. We watched her go, and no one said anything. We watched the fog overlay her and make her insubstantial. Not a human being anymore, but a pencil ink sketch of a human being done on the world's whitest paper, and no one said anything. For a moment, it was like the letters of the Keep Right sign had seemed to float on nothingness. Her arms and legs and pallid blonde hair were all gone, and only the misty remnants of her red summer dress remained, seeming to dance in white limbo. Then her dress was gone too, and no one said anything.